than normal for us when we have technical difficulties. Guys, I know this is probably going to be an Alabama heavy chat. Georgia fans wanting to talk about how bad they're going to beat Alabama next week, and Alabama fans wanting to know what in the world happened for 3.5 quarters. But Josh, before we get into that, welcome everybody. Including you podcast listeners, because I know that this is getting pretty popular there. I want to say thanks to everybody who showed up last week with me being out and Josh handling it solo. Josh, it was our biggest live stream ever. I don't know what that says about me, but
I mean, I'm not going to say anything, but I think it all speaks for itself, right?
Yeah. But let's get going with this. And Josh, the first thing I think we need to talk about, like, because it happened so early in the day, and I'm not going to get into my hate for the big noon kickoff thing. But the biggest kind of crazy of the day, obviously, was Michigan handling Ohio State. And before we get into the kind of the X's and O's and what happened in the game, talk about kind of what this does for the college football landscape, what it is for Michigan, playoffs, all that kind of thing. Because I know those thoughts have been rattling around in your head all day.
So obviously it turns a lot of the college football world upside down, and we talked about it a lot. The odds of college football working out the way everybody had assumed it was going to were probably pretty slim. I'll say the odds of college football working out the way that the rankings look like this year right now are probably pretty slim. But the big thing this does maybe pumps up Alabama and Cincinnati a little bit in the pecking order. I'm not sure how much really Michigan's going to be viewed that differently than Ohio State. I mean, maybe like a notch lower or half a notch lower just because of Ohio State's dominance throughout the year. But it's the same record. It's the same team. And I think they end up in the same slot. Honestly, the biggest thing this does, if you want to take this angle, is it changes up just how volatile the championship Saturday is going to be or could be, right? Because now you're going to have Iowa versus Michigan. And I think the odds of Iowa beating Michigan are a lot higher than probably the odds of Iowa beating Ohio State. Because I don't think Iowa's not going to be able to keep up with Ohio State offensively, even on a bad day. But Iowa's shown the ability to shut down teams that are maybe a little less dynamic. Other than that, honestly, I don't know. I mean, other than saying Michigan's in Ohio State's place, I mean, my honest opinion is I don't know that there's really a huge change for the lineup for everybody else. Well, I don't know if you disagree with me on that.
To me, after seeing what Alabama did tonight, and look, I know a lot of Alabama fans are going to say Iron Bowl, Jordan Hare voodoo, all that sort of thing. And to some extent, they're right. But we've seen enough of this to see that there's some real cracks in that foundation at Alabama. So combine that with how Michigan won today and honestly their resume. I've got Michigan at number 2, but kind of what you're hinting at is it's kind of academic because what we're looking at in Oklahoma State, Oklahoma, I could see there being a 2-loss Big 12 champion. So at that point, it really means either Michigan wins out, or if they don't, Alabama, as long as they don't get blown out next week, probably makes it into the playoffs anyway. Maybe Notre Dame sneaks in, but I think all this did because the matchup for in the Big Ten championship game, I think Ohio State is probably a tougher matchup or a little bit different one. I think this gave Cincinnati, Alabama, maybe Notre Dame a little bit of breathing room, maybe. But honestly, Josh, isn't it just academic? Like, haven't we seen enough from Alabama this year that if they don't beat Georgia, they're probably out and they need to be?
I mean, this is the conversation we get into a lot, right? If Alabama loses to Georgia, Alabama does not deserve to be in the playoff. But if Alabama loses to Georgia, I think there are a lot of scenarios where they're going to deserve to be in the playoff more than the other teams that are available. That's the problem.
What if Michigan loses? You said this last week, and I'm interrupting you. I'm sorry, but I want you to touch on it because you said it about Alabama. I want you to say if it's the same for Michigan. Last week you said, and I agree, that if Alabama loses a relatively close game to Georgia, it's not fair for Notre Dame to jump them because Notre Dame is sitting at home. You can't punish a team for playing the best team in the country while the other team is sitting at home. And I asked this question, though, Josh, Isn't that the same thing for Michigan? Like as it relates to Notre Dame?
I think it's a little different because they're
Does the
going to
opponent?
have lost. They're going to lose to an Iowa team that isn't Georgia. That's the truth of the matter, right? They're going to lose to an Iowa team that's like 15th ish. Alabama will have lost to number one in the SEC championship game. And I think there's a big difference. My point was Alabama gets knocked out of the playoff by losing to a team that everyone would pick to beat Notre Dame by multiple touchdowns. Michigan would be knocked out of the playoff by a team that would be picked to lose to Notre Dame. So that's really different, right? That's really, really different. And the whole trick here is if you look, like you go down the schedule, Michigan State and Wisconsin end up Michigan State, Wisconsin, and Ohio State are Michigan's wins. So it's 3 ranked wins. Outside those games, Michigan hasn't looked super impressive. I mean, 32-29 to Nebraska, on top of 2013 to Rutgers, on top of 21-17 to Penn State. There have been some good wins in there, but the loss to Michigan State, I don't think is fantastic. I mean, I know they're ranked really high, but I'm going to be blunt. I think it's a little bit by default. Notre Dame's schedule was atrocious, so that kind of balances it out a little bit. Michigan is not quite in the same boat in my mind that Alabama is, just because the schedule hasn't been consistently as good. And I know some Big Ten fans are going to take umbrage, but it's true. And more importantly, the conversation we were having is what happens if they lose the championship game. And there's a big difference between losing to number 1 Georgia and losing to number 15 Iowa. There just is.
And a lot of Notre Dame fans are saying now, like, look, it's only fair we go 11-1. We shouldn't be jumped by a 2-loss team. But to your point, there's a point you've made and a point I'm going to make. To your point, it's like, yeah, but they played a 13th game. So you compare the first 12 games that each of them played, and at this point, I don't know that Notre Dame's 11-1 is more impressive than Alabama's 11-1. To my point, that I don't know that a lot of people realize, because Notre Dame's murdering people this month. Notre Dame plays 3 teams with at least 8 losses in the month of November. 3. And so it is a lot easier to look great, and we say this all the time, when you murder everybody. And so people, but if you're murdering people because they're not very good, then that has to be weighed. We always have this recency bias, like, oh, this team looks really good, they're on a roll. But you don't have to go back that far to see Notre Dame losing to the only team that they played that was very good this year.
Yeah, and like I've seen somebody like bull crap and all this other stuff. Look, let me be really clear in the conversation we're having and the question he's asking. He's saying, if Iowa beats Michigan, should Michigan stay in front of Notre Dame? Because the conversation we had is Alabama's 11-1, and should losing to Georgia in a game that Notre Dame doesn't have to play means Notre Dame jumps Alabama. And my point was, I don't really think that's fair. And that's just, Notre Dame not being in a conference means they shouldn't get that much of a benefit for not having to play a 13th game, especially not a 13th game against number 1 Georgia. And my point was, I don't know that it carries quite the same way for Michigan, just because the opponent is number 15 Iowa, not number 1 Georgia. If it was number 1 Georgia, I'd have the same opinion. It's not about Alabama and Michigan. It's really just about the opponent. And if you want to get into the game of what happens if you lose that game, I think that conversation is very different because of who you're losing to.
Yes, people are saying that we don't think Michigan is good or is going to lose to Iowa. We're not saying that. This is a hypothetical scenario. I've got Michigan number 2 in my top 10 when we do it. Like, I think that they've earned it. They've got a very impressive win over Ohio State today because it wasn't even close. Notre Dame, that's the one that frustrates me because they get to stay out of a conference, which means they also they do schedule a lot of name brands, and they deserve credit for that. But the thing is, what's happened lately is those name brands, the best one on their schedule has been like an 7 or 8 win team. When you play in a conference, you have to play through either you play in the Big 10 or the Big 12 and you play everybody, or you have to play a conference champion as a path to the playoffs, or at some point you play the best team, one of the best teams in the country, because at some point there's going to be another good team in that conference. And we saw that with Notre Dame last year in the ACC. And if that scenario was happening this year, Notre Dame wouldn't be in the playoffs. So that's what frustrates us. Okay, Josh, do you want to comment before we get into Alabama? I know that we got some super chats and we got some people that are really ready for us to talk about Alabama and Auburn and maybe Alabama, Georgia. Do you want to comment about what's going on right now? Oklahoma up 33-24 right now in Oklahoma State. Texas A&M and LSU locked in a knockdown drag out. Do you want to comment on either of those games before we get into the rest of the action that we've seen?
Yeah, I mean, I'll note, sort of skipping our in-game messaging, I feel like we never really actually got into Michigan Ohio State, what happened in the game, and I'm not sure.
Yeah, I want to do a full like a cut up review of that game, but I just wanted to get through some super chats and some other discussion before we did that.
All right, fair enough. Yeah, Oklahoma and Oklahoma State, it's been interesting because we talked about how Oklahoma State's rush defense has been so dominant, and Kennedy Brooks is 6.1 yards per carry. They've held Caleb Williams in check, but the defense has not really locked him down. What I find interesting in this game, really more than anything, is the numbers that are being put up by Oklahoma don't quite support the statistics or the scoring they have. I mean, they're outgaining Oklahoma State by about 70 yards, but they're one of three, 4-12 on third down. They're tied in first downs, 8.2 yards per attempt, 4 yards per carry. Those are not great numbers. It's been negative plays and missed opportunities from Oklahoma State more than anything that have caused this game to swing against them. 320 yards for 33 points and 320 yards is actually kind of on the high end. This game is not. Oklahoma's winning it fair and square, and I'm not trying to take away from that, but Oklahoma is on the high end of what could happen, and this is a little bit more just Oklahoma State shouldn't really be down 2 scores given the way it's going, I think. But that's the reality of it. I find it interesting both in terms of Oklahoma State's inability to slow down an Oklahoma offense that has not been super overly potent, but also the fact that I think Oklahoma State's kind of blowing their shot in a game that they're not really that badly outmatched or being outplayed by that much. Oklahoma State is better per play passing and throwing, or running and throwing right now than Oklahoma, and they're still down 2 scores. So kind of an indicator of how this game's going.
So let's run through some super chats before we get into maybe some game reviews. Shane says, call me crazy, but this Bama team makes me so angry and happy. I never want this season to end. Screw it. Bama beats Georgia by 40 in sarcasm. It is interesting because like there's a lot of excitement from Bama fans tonight. Obviously, beating Auburn is a huge deal, especially coming from maybe the depths of despair they were feeling halfway through the third quarter. But we'll get into it later, Josh. But I think that the line that came out, Bama plus 6 is a little bit tighter than people maybe expected. All right, Josh, I'm gonna let you tackle this one, and maybe I'll piggyback on. Mike Farino says, I think Alabama no longer deserves the benefit of the doubt. 4-1 score games now versus unranked teams. They lose and they should be done. Doesn't it matter what everybody else does, Josh?
Yeah, it's if this was like 2018 where you had multiple undefeated teams and you had UCF undefeated sitting the wings, not in the playoff, we might have a very different discussion, right? You had Oklahoma that was like a dominant offense, 1-loss team. Clemson, Ohio State, Notre Dame, everybody was up there at the top. This is not the same year. And one of the things that is our biggest pet peeve on this channel is when people start playing the game of X team doesn't deserve to be in the playoffs, period. And that's the point I made earlier. Alabama does not deserve to be in the playoffs, but this is why we don't think the playoffs really need to be expanded, because it's rare to find 4 teams that deserve to be in the playoff. But if Alabama isn't in the playoff, you start having to play the game of who else goes in. And we've already gone over why I don't think Notre Dame deserves to be in over them. And so in my mind, the only other team with an argument is this winner of the Oklahoma State-Oklahoma game, if they win out. And I think it's an argument. But that's it. So, yeah, and then on top of that, the 4-1 score wins over unranked teams is not true. So first off, let's throw that out statistically, because that's one of the things that always drives me nuts when people throw out a stat like that. If you want to play unranked at the time of play, Texas A&M was unranked, right? LSU was unranked. Auburn was unranked. But Florida was number 11 and Arkansas was number 21. And if you want to play ranked now, then A&M gets ranked and some of the other teams are. So it wasn't for one score wins over unranked teams. The truth is Alabama actually had a very difficult schedule. The other truth is their defense has been up and down. The offense has been up and down. They're not well put together, but that's true for everybody in the country, including Ohio State to this point, which is why they lost to Michigan. So, if you want to make those complaints, let's have a conversation about how Cincinnati had 3 straight one-score wins over bad G5 teams. Because that's a hell of a lot more indictment to me than struggling with Florida when way before Florida was given up on the season, an LSU team that is clearly playing much better football at the end of the year, and an Auburn team that took Penn State and a lot of other teams down to the wire. And I don't think they're nearly as bad as their record.
Yeah, and Eric piggybacked on that and said Bama's no way a top 4 team with barely beating 3 mediocre SEC teams and losing to 1. So, first of all, if everybody's mediocre, nobody's mediocre, right?
Well, let's be clear. We're counting Arkansas as mediocre because I think that's really harsh.
That's the thing is like we only discredit the teams that we don't like in the conference we don't like, right? But if we look at actual objective data, this Oklahoma State team, if they win the next 2 games, is going to be in the playoffs. They're going to be considered a top 4 team. They did not schedule a Power 5 team out of conference. They opened the season with a 7-point win over Missouri State. Then they beat Tulsa by 5, and then they beat a bad Boise State team by 1. So I'm okay with us, and we've been on Alabama all year. I'm totally okay with us crushing Alabama for these. This is why we don't think they're a championship team. But if we're going to compare resumes, then first of all, you got to penalize the fact that out of all 10 Big 12 teams, Big 12 teams, their best win is over BYU. And then they have a number of really close wins over bad G5 teams or lost to a G5 or beat an FCS or something like that. I mean, Kansas lost to CCU by 27 points, lost to Duke by 20 points, and then turned around and almost beat Oklahoma. So I like you, Josh, this is what we always say. Pick out whatever team that you want to pick apart their resume and say they don't belong here. Because they do this to us in our rankings too when we do top 10 rankings. I'm okay with that. But make sure you follow it up with who belongs there instead so we can counter you, which is what I think a fair discussion would be.
Yeah, the frustration here with Alabama, as it will be for whoever ends up in the playoff and honestly in the 3 or 4 slot when we get in that discussion, is that we're going to hate whoever the 3 and 4 picks are, and we're going to say they don't deserve to be in there. And and people are not going to have an argument for who should be in ahead, except maybe Notre Dame. And Notre Dame's schedule is a lot of want to talk about mediocre teams. It's a lot of mediocre and then some bad teams. It ended up being a much easier schedule than was anticipated. And again, like Alabama loses to Georgia in the SEC championship game. Okay, Notre Dame already lost to Cincinnati. So you're already dealing with a situation that they've already lost to a playoff team in fairly convincing fashion. So
yeah, and what you always say
Cincinnati we're assuming is in, right?
Right.
So it's tough. It's tough.
Right. And what you're always saying is everybody deserves to be in the playoffs if they're a Power 5 undefeated until they lose. Once you lose, you bring in subjectivity and this cross comparison to other teams and all of that. And so that's the thing that hurt Ohio State. That's in multiple years. That's the thing that's going to hurt whomever is in those 3 and 4 slots this year. And like you said, like we're not sitting here saying Alabama is a championship team. We're saying if we want to put them in the playoffs or don't want to put them in the playoffs, fair is fair. Let's compare everybody's resumes and everybody's scenarios. And I'm really, Josh, I'm not going to go on a rant, but I'm really on this thing about the Big 12. There's 3 teams in the Big 12 that did not play a Power 5 team out of conference. And then we have a bunch of bad results in the 30 games they did play out of conference, which most of, a lot of them, I think I saw a number where there was like 18 bad results of either a loss to a team with a losing record, a P5 team, a loss to a G5, or barely beating a G5 or FCS. That's terrible. When you look at Big 10 and SEC teams that are just bombing people out of conference, we have no data to go on. We think Oklahoma or Oklahoma State or Baylor is going to be good because of their win-loss record, when in reality, the Big 12 has played nobody out of conference. They circle the wagons in conference, and those wins got to go somewhere, and they're going to the Big 12.
Yeah, the Big 12 beating itself up does not mean that they're good. And, I'm going to say this now because I don't think it's giving away any future content. I don't have a lot of confidence that the Big 12 is going to hold up in the bowl slate. And we're going to probably put some stuff out there, especially around playoff selection time, about this. When you look at the out of conference results, I think the Big 12 is the result of beating itself. And I don't think there's much evidence that anyone in the Big 12 is particularly good. And we saw that a couple of years ago. I made the point that the Big 12 did not have a single win over any P5 team with a winning record. Not one. I think they played like two, and they lost both of them handily. That was 2019. One was LSU, which was the best, and there were like two others, and that was it. And they lost them all. And the Big 12 really has the same kind of resume this year. They're playing might as well be playing in a different division. And that's about the end of it. And I know we're making all the Big 12 fans, well, not that many because they're all watching the Oklahoma State game. We're making a lot of them mad, but that's just the reality of it. It's easy to say they have depth. It's easy to say, but why? Because you've got a lot of teams that have average records because they beat each other. If you look at the out-of-conference results from that conference, they were bad. And that's not something you can just ignore or wipe away. That's the only thing we have to consider when we look at them and compare them to teams in other conferences. And I think, I'm totally with you. So that's my rant. If you didn't want to go on there.
One final thing, and I got a super chat we'll touch on. We got a bunch of them. The top three, there's 3 top 10 teams in the Big 10 right now, Big 12 right now. They all beat Texas by 1 score. Arkansas murdered Texas, and Alabama got criticized for beating Arkansas by 1 score, which they should as a championship team. But all these other Big 12 teams should also be criticized as well. That's all I'm saying. All right, Mark Blanton said, what's the line on the Bama-Georgia game next week? 10, 14, 17. It's actually already come out. I believe it is Georgia laying 6.
Yep.
Okay, let's get through a few more of these. Josh, let you take this one. Evan says the stars are aligned for Georgia this year. Kind of feels like that, right?
Yeah, it's the weakest slate in – thinking through the years, maybe 17, probably before 17, right? I would say before 16, before 15, 14. I would say this is the easiest playoff slate since 2014. 2014 wasn't particularly good. Oklahoma,
No.
You had Oregon get in there. Florida State looked bad all year. They could end up being a lot like Oklahoma if they make the playoff.
Not a great Bama team.
No, not a great. That was one of Bama's, really one of their least talented teams in years. They were in total rebuilding mode from that 11-13 run. And yeah, Ohio State ended up that being their year and run with it. I could see this year being a lot for Georgia like Ohio State was that year, where as good as they were and as talented as they were, which is what everyone focuses on, the truth of the matter is, and I'm going to make a lot of Ohio State fans mad, I probably shouldn't go down this road, that Ohio State team and the 2015 team really, really underachieved, in my opinion, based compared to what they should have done. I don't have a particularly high opinion of the Alabama team they played, and they got lucky that they ended up playing an Oregon team that really wasn't that great. I don't know that 2014 Ohio State team, based off how they played that year, would have necessarily won the championship more often than not. But in that season, they were easily the best in the playoff. And I think Georgia's having the stars align in the same way.
And most Ohio State fans will agree with you that they absolutely underachieved in 2015 with that roster, because that roster was wow. But I counter with, you got Michigan State without their starting quarterback, I think it was Connor Cook, and lost to their backup quarterback at home because you felt like not running the ball with a pretty good running back. And then Alabama dragged Michigan State at a neutral site with Connor Cook. So there's that. All right. So Joseph L says, remember last week when I said, why are we assuming Michigan will lose? And the chat roasted me about that. Love the show, boys. So Josh, you took a little heat too. Not a lot, which I think says a lot. And maybe we revisit this. Normally when you go out on a limb, when you're proven right, either one of us, but you're proven right more than I am on going out on a limb. Normally when you do that, all week leading up to it, you get dragged in the comments. Was it kind of interesting that I only saw a few people roasting you for your close score prediction? And we follow all the threads on all the forums. Um, and we weren't getting, and you weren't getting dragged on 11 Warriors on the thread that was over there. You weren't getting dragged on Buckeye Scoop for picking a reasonably close game. Is there something to that, you think?
I think most Ohio State fans knew they were vulnerable, and most Ohio State fans were aware of the fact that this was one of the better Michigan teams in years. I picked I picked Michigan against the spread, but I picked them to lose, but close. We talked a lot that it wouldn't shock me at all if Michigan won the game. Oh my gosh, LSU just hit
They're
a
going to
deep
win.
touchdown pass
They're going to win.
with
What
20
a throw.
seconds left in the game to take the
What a
lead over
throw.
A&M. Wow. With like a 7-man rush, guy in his face. That was
LSU be like, we don't
clutch.
even want Jimbo anymore.
Yeah, that was yep, that was clutch. They're trying to avoid a 5. Teams play hard when they're 5-6 because you want that 6-6 record in a bowl game because you get $500 a piece in swag. I'm just saying that's the way it is. But no, Michigan probably ruined any video we're going to try to do. Maybe you can cut this. Michigan. I mean, they were a good team. They're just a good team. They've been good all year. The biggest thing that has taken heat for me with Ohio State fans, and you as well, is our constant point that there were things that Ohio State was struggling with all year that really got remedied when they play teams that were particularly weak in one area or another, right? Like the defense was awesome when they were playing teams that were atrocious offensively. The offense was awesome when they were playing like Akron. And then when they started playing teams that were better units in one area or another, like Penn State, all of a sudden the offense looks really sputtery again. And I all year long, I think Ohio State had the potential to be an explosive, phenomenal team, but the chinks were always there in the armor and they never went away. And I think most Ohio State fans, and I think that something, frankly, it's something to be said for a lot of the schools that have been there, done that, been in the playoffs multiple times. Ohio State's been in the playoffs and lost, been shut out in the first round. You've got more awareness of we can be a team that is undefeated to this point and then lose or get blown out, right? Um, Aware of how different it is when you play in a big time game against a really high quality opponent and how things can suddenly go against you that were not wrong all year. And I think most Ohio State fans were realizing that they were kind of on board with that dynamic. I think people were surprised by the outcome, but the one thing we talked about is Ohio State's run defense had not been particularly good, and Michigan had the ability to run the ball some, and it just got away with them. But yeah, the offensive line woes from early in the season were the same offensive line woes at the end of the year. It's actually the same thing as what happened with Alabama and Auburn, right? The same chinks that had been there early against even some lesser opponents, and it had been there like the LSU game showed up again in wild fashion when they were, in crunch time against Auburn.
Yeah, and I think that really there's two problems in this game for Ohio State, and they have shown up all year. One, the offense and the scoring efficiency woes are present, and they'll put up a bucket load of yards and not a bucket load of points. And that hurt him here because I think that against Michigan State, they were and you pointed this out, so easily allowing or able to put them out of their game plan. And because they were just scoring and scoring and scoring, but they weren't able to do that to Michigan, and Michigan got to keep running the ball. And so I think that was a problem. But that defense was pretty bad today. I mean, if I'm being honest, it was as bad as Alabama's offense for 3.5 quarters. That defense was bad, and I think that something that you've been pointing out all year that you did get heat for that stretch in the middle where they were lights out. It was a little bit of fool's gold. Kiltac9 says he thinks we need to add some type of quarterback pressure to our model to help with the scores. Seems like it's a huge factor in both games. So Josh, I'll let you handle this in general, but I'll say a couple of things. One, just like we don't want to adjust the playoffs this year, we don't necessarily want to change our model because of a weird season. This year with super seniors and whatever, like everybody's going to say, they're going to look back and say this is the year of the defense. I'm going to say it's the year of really bad offensive line and quarterback play. We don't want to make too many adjustments to something that might be a 1-year aberration. Um, and then I forgot my second point, so I'll let you go ahead and tackle it.
Yeah, the issue with doing that with the model is the moment that I start messing with a model to add in factors like people want to like weight turnovers, recruiting rankings, or whatever, it's me sticking my hand in and saying, I think QB pressures are the most important thing. And at some level, my model becomes QB pressure based. Um, and we try very hard to let the model determine scores based off what it thinks is important because we're really not trying to make the most accurate predictor possible, which is something people don't completely understand most of the time. Oh my gosh. Texas A&M quarterback falls down on fourth down. That's or with time expiring. How bad? Um, the reality is we're trying to make a model that is a neutral baseline, something that's interesting for us, but also more importantly, just gives us a neutral look at how good the two teams are. And look, QB pressures have been really important in some games, and they haven't been important in others. And it's easy to say that they're really, really notable. And I know Kiltack saying, to his credit, like, hey, that's a fair point. But it's really easy to overreact to problems in one game or another. Alabama had two backup offensive linemen in that game. They have a backup center for like the second or third time this year. They end up having to play a backup center due to an injury to the starter. How much does that screw up offensive lines? I've seen so many teams lose games where the starting center goes out because usually he's responsible for all the line calls and shifts and for the cadence, and it just sort of screws everything up, especially on the road. And if you overreact to that and how much it was a factor in this game, it may not be a factor in the next one. So I just try to be really cautious. And to the
Yeah.
effect that, and there are plenty of stats in there with the way our model works that don't take that into account, but I'd rather let it be taken into account naturally.
Yeah, we don't want to work backwards from results to build a model, because those results, like you said, are relevant in one scenario and not in another. Jermaine Jones, huge friend of the program, is here every Saturday all year. What happens when Georgia plays a good offense? Honestly, we may have already seen the good offenses. I think this year, and this is what I was kind of noting in my last point, there's not a lot of good offense being played this year. Frankly, the way Georgia's playing offense is some of the better offense in college football. So, and based on Alabama's struggles, I'm not so sure that they're going to go into this. They're going to finish the SEC championship game having played a good offense. But Josh, if they clear the Bama hurdle, might Georgia go the whole year without playing a great offense? Because who are they going to play in the playoffs?
Yeah, I mean, who is define good offense, right? Because the best one they've played is Tennessee. And this is where college football gets really big into context, which is always a big point of our channel, that you do have to have some understanding behind the numbers. Florida would probably be the second best offense, except I think the Anthony Richardson experiment that they went with in that Georgia game was an abject disaster. Would you agree with me there?
Yeah, it was maybe some pressure from fans or whatever, but it was a bad idea.
Yeah, it was bad. They didn't go back to that well. They shouldn't have gone back to the well. They tried it a little bit today, and he looked just as inconsistent. He's a great athlete and a great talent. He does not know how to play the quarterback position. He just doesn't. And I know Auburn or Florida fans are slobbering over the talent, and they're missing the fact that he doesn't know how to play quarterback yet at this level. Oklahoma State, now it's one score game again. But I do think there's an argument that the best offenses in the SEC were probably outside of Georgia, who you could argue is the best offense, at least at a point per drive consistency basis. They probably have been. But it would have been Ole Miss and Alabama that were the two most explosive. But after them, early season LSU was really good, which is weird to say because a lot of people didn't watch them at that point. When they had all the receivers, they were good. But since then, it's probably been Arkansas and Tennessee.
Yep.
And they played both of those teams, and they shut them both down completely. So you can rag them for not playing Ole Miss and Alabama, but this is sort of I will say this is a catch-22 for the point you just made. If we want to rag how good the offenses are, then not playing the very best sometimes can hide things in and of itself. And I think Ohio State was in that same category. I don't think I buy that argument. I just don't. Because of how dominant Georgia has been, it doesn't translate that well. And they've played reasonably good offenses to the point where it's hard to dominate, 37-0 over Arkansas. But there's something to be said that none of those teams have any semblance of balance or consistency or production. Arkansas was the one exception, but as we saw the past couple weeks, when KJ Jefferson is injured, that team is not good. We saw that with the Missouri game when he got dinged up. They need Jefferson to run, and he was really hobbling. So I don't know. I want to spend time on that now because I really don't want to get into this at length in our preview. I think it's kind of a red herring, but those are my honest thoughts if people are asking them.
Yeah, I'll say that I just don't think offenses are that good this year, and I think that bodes well for Georgia because I don't think they're going to be hugely hugely challenged. A few more super chats. Kiltack said, "No hate on y'all's model, pretty dang good." No, Kiltack, it was a great question. Like I think it helps us get into some of the nuances and details of running a model at all. So I appreciate that. Stephen Light. His team takes L's and he shows up. His team gets wins and he shows up. I hope he's still on the chat, still on the show, because I think he was one of the earlier question or super chats. Another crazy Saturday. Thanks for another live stream. As a Penn State fan, the end of the season cannot come soon enough. Look, Penn State played their hearts out today, and that's a tough scenario with the weather and all that. I hate it. I hate it for Penn State fans because this is a better team than their record will go down at the end, and nobody's going to remember this team other than their win-loss record, and it's unfortunate because they're a better team than their record. So
can I make a transitive property note because people are already calling us SEC homers, so I'll throw this out there. I think Penn State is a lot better team than their record. Penn State takes Michigan State down to the wire, and everyone's going to rack on Alabama for having this close game against Auburn. We say this all the time, and we're fair with it, but you have to take it into account. Those out-of-conference games are the only data point you have to compare one conference to another early in the year. Auburn looked darn even with that Penn State team that was highly competitive in the Big Ten. And Auburn's going to finish 6-6. It just says a lot to me about where the medium to lower half of the SEC is, because Auburn's clearly in the low half of the SEC.
And Arkansas to Texas data point is relevant. And Mississippi State to NC State data point's relevant.
People are going to call us SEC homers, and I'm just going to I'm trying to get this out of the way now and deal with it. And yeah, I mean, you got to take it away. Sorry, I paused because I just saw Oklahoma's Hazelwood just kick the ball out of bounds, which is a flag, and I think may give possession to the other team. You can't do that. And I think that's illegal batting, and I think it actually may, on a fumble, that gives the other team possession. So that was a disastrous mistake, if I remember this penalty right. But we can pick back up on that. Knowing we're going to be called SEC homers, the reality is there's a lot of evidence that the SEC is actually the best conference this year, top to bottom, maybe even by a significant margin.
Yeah, so here's the thing on the SEC homer thing. If you want to tell us Alabama is bad because they barely beat the team that dragged Texas out of conference or barely beat the team that went on the road and gave Penn State a game out of conference, that's fine. We've said the same. We've said they're not putting up championship material this year. That's fine. But you don't get to tell me that the team that beat Missouri State by 7 points or Tulsa by 5 or Tulane by 5 or Kansas by whatever points, whoever the Big 12 champion is going to be, you don't get to tell me that we can't point that out either without being homers. Okay, Josh, a couple more of these because we're getting behind. Dave Linsky says the Axe is back in Minnesota. F the Badgers, row the boat. Honestly, a big game for them against a Wisconsin team that a lot of people were saying it had turned the corner after their early season struggles. So I do think that's a huge, huge win.
It is. I mean, it's a big win for the Minnesota program, especially based off where they're at right now. And, making the Big Ten championship is a big step forward. Not the Big Ten championship. I guess, would have been a big step forward. And just a momentary brain fart. I know better than this. Obviously, Iowa's in the Big Ten championship. We talked about it earlier. But that's kind of my thing, is they upset a Wisconsin team, and this is me being the horrible Green Ripper person that I am. This is beating a Wisconsin team that in the year, and I'm double checking, right? They did not beat a ranked team. In fact, they're going to end the season. Well, they beat Iowa. Their one win was over Iowa, 27-7. They were blown out by Michigan. They were blown out badly by Notre Dame. They lost the opener to Penn State. I'll be frank, the Big Ten East is just not all that good. I mean, do you disagree with me? I think there are a couple good, really good defenses, but overall quality, the Big Ten East is not a particularly good division. Even by people are going to say well, look at the SEC East. The SEC East has Georgia. The Big Ten East is not any better, or not. I can say East. Big Ten West. The Big Ten West is not any better, in my opinion, really than probably the Big 12. And I'm not even sure how much better they are than the. If you want to look at defenses like Clemson, I'm not sure how much better they really are than the ACC.
So I would give you a little pushback there, mainly in the general comment, because you did go a little Grim Reaper and say, "Oh, great win for Minnesota. By the way, your win sucked." But yeah, I think that what you said in the beginning was the point that matters. Context matters around expectations of a team that started out kind of struggle bus in Minnesota. So to have a win like this is a good building block, and it gives them some momentum going into bowl season. So I think that in this year, in this season of, you can't really do the transitive property thing. You can't really do they're consistently good because they consistently beat bad teams thing. Wins are golden this year, in a year that in years past that they haven't been. All right. So Mucho Mango says, thoughts on Auburn losing to South Carolina as a result of prepping for Alabama. Was it similar to Florida LSU last year? I don't think so, Josh. I think it was more a side effect of having to replace your quarterback with someone who's, one, not very good, and two, you weren't great at the position to begin with. You don't have a great offense to begin with. I think that's a big part of it. And just a team that was able to shorten the clock, kind of like LSU did to Alabama this year.
And would this be okay with you? I think this is maybe a good time to transition into really talking substantively about Alabama and Auburn. Can we go ahead and start getting into that?
Absolutely.
Here's the thing about that Alabama and Auburn game. Sorry, I was getting messages from my wife with trying to help me figure out something out. Alabama outgained Auburn 388 yards to 159. There were a lot of things that went the way it did for that Alabama and Auburn game to be close. It was close legitimately, but Auburn gave South Carolina everything they had, and they lost the game because the offense was really inept. Auburn just had a game where they averaged 0.6 yards per carry and 5.3 yards per attempt. The thing that was consistent in the South Carolina game and the Alabama game was that the defense was lights out. Auburn lost to South Carolina because they made a really stupid decision to go for it on 4th and short on their own 30 with Tank Bigsby on the sideline. And if they don't do that, they beat South Carolina.
Yep.
So the same thing that lost them that game lost them this game, and that's the fact that their offense without Bo Nix is just inept. And only the Alabama game, they actually had Hudson, who's their best receiver. And without him, they were just shot in the South Carolina game. So I moreover than that, I think it's complete. I actually think the results are consistent. And Auburn, Penn State, probably the same boat as Wisconsin. They're teams that can beat good teams because their defense is really, really good. But their offense is so inconsistent and so inept at times. And again, Auburn had 159 total yards in that game. That's why they lost to South Carolina, because when you have that kind of production, like Wisconsin today against Minnesota, and I'm not taking away from the win and saying this, Wisconsin and Minnesota, Wisconsin had, and I saw the stats earlier, but it was here we have 4.5 yards per attempt, 2.8 yards per carry. And when you operate like that and you're that dependent on the defense, yeah, you can beat a giant, but you can also very easily lose to a South Carolina because anybody can stop your offense from scoring.
Yeah, I think that the issue for me though is, and I don't know that Auburn, like a lot of people are going to say Auburn was was overly good against Alabama, maybe played above their heads a little bit, but I'm not sure that's the case, Josh. And this is what, look, if I'm an Alabama fan, this is what scares me about next week is that the book has been out on this Alabama offense since the LSU game. Alabama has had plenty of time to adjust. They've had 3 weeks to do it, and they have been unable to adjust to a fifth man or a sixth man coming at Bryce Young. They've already got a bad offensive line. I think it's a mixture of, one, things that can't be corrected in season, two, a quarterback that gets the absolute yips sometimes, and three, an offensive staff that I honestly don't think has done a great job this year. And maybe you're not as tough on Bill O'Brien and Marone as I am, but man, I just can't. There just seems to be no adjustments at all. And I say that to say Auburn played good defensively, but there was a lot of self-inflicted drops and sacks when there was an easy outlet or a lot of things that went bad for Alabama that Auburn had nothing to do with.
Yeah, and I want to see if we can start blowing through some of these super chats. But the big thing with me when you talk Alabama and coaching, like I saw on Twitter, people are like, "Well, where's the screen game going?" Like you don't run screens when a team is playing bump and run coverage and bringing pressure. You actually don't, because if you throw a screen pass, there's a guy in man coverage on that guy's hip. That's how you throw interceptions on screens, be it running back or receiver screens. LSU game was a little different because they were actually playing off coverage. That was weird. But my big thing with them is that they don't do anything to make the game easy. College football in the RPO era has a lot of stuff that makes it easy for a quarterback or easy for an offense to move forward and get yards. And this Oklahoma State game is a turnover machine. But the problem for me with what Alabama's been doing in Bill O'Brien is they run a million checks at the line of scrimmage. They are always snapping the ball with like 5 seconds left on the play clock. They have a lot of complicated reads, a lot of downfield routes, lots of like 3 and 4 vertical concepts, very pro style concepts with how you read and throw against zone and man. And they've abandoned a lot of the easy built-in completions that Sarkisian had really brought to the offense last year. They did a lot of stuff with like orbit motion and with rollouts that gave them easy plays. When was the last time you saw Alabama roll out Bryce Young intentionally?
Right.
Now, there's a lot to that. The fact that teams are bringing a lot of outside pressure. When you bring slot pressure, you can't really roll out the quarterback. But if you threaten to do that, then you can at least call out the slot pressure and throw against it. And it just feels like they are requiring Bryce Young to be the best quarterback in college football by far to operate that offense. And with an offensive line that's not been very good, and with a receiving core that is not up to their standard for the past several years, I think it's a serious mistake. And maybe Bryce Young, and I've heard that he's really mentally adept, but he looks totally overwhelmed to me on the field, especially in a hostile environment where they don't have a regular snap count because it's so loud. Take some off the kid, have some built-in plays and shot plays, and it's just not there. So that's sort of my 2 cents on Alabama's offense and Bill O'Brien.
Yeah, and the thing for me, there's a couple of glaring issues there for me that point to coaching. One, at some point when Bryce Young is like, it's been an issue all year. I've noticed watching Alabama play, the checks are a real problem because if you have offensive line in a stance for 20 seconds and then there's 9 seconds left on the clock and you do a check with 9 seconds left and you're down to like 3 or 4, you leave yourself no margin for error to snap the ball, which leads to having to take a lot of unnecessary timeouts. But two, a lot of the checks he's calling and audibles at the line, one, they take forever. The 30 seconds melting down the clock, like they take forever. But two, a lot of times he's checking into like a run blitz or he's checking into like plays, like you said earlier, plays that the defense is goading him into. And every time Alabama runs tempo, I feel like he doesn't have to think about things and he's just dimes. So it's really strange to me. And like you said, it's requiring him to be someone that they shouldn't be putting on his shoulders, especially with the offensive line play that they've had. Do you think this is a situation where it's just not a good fit at offensive coordinator? Because while his offense might be good for the NFL, it doesn't give enough easy rhythm type of plays for Bryce Young or any college quarterback to really take advantage of the talent they do have?
Yeah, there's a reason everybody in college football has gone to this concept of having play cards on the sideline and hurry up and then calls, checks from the coaches. It's a thing that the clock rules in college allow you to do. And Bill O'Brien is trying to call plays and require checks like he's got his voice in the helmet and this is an NFL game. And it's not realistic. And it puts a lot of burden on Bryce Young that doesn't need to exist because you can make those same checks and audibles from the sideline with a well-designed scheme. I don't think Alabama can just like change that overnight, right? Because the offense is what the offense is. And if you haven't built an entire offense around those sideline checks and schemes, you're not going to be able to do it. But yeah, I think it has been a failure, but that's the problem. That's the real problem. And a lot of it, Bryce Young is not operating well in that offense at times, and he's going to get a ton of Heisman hype. And I think both of you are on the same page here. I don't really think it's warranted. But and I'll take a super chat here. Shane talked about Will Anderson Jr. and Bryce Young are fantastic players. I'm blessed to watch them every week for another year. Win or lose, I love this squad. If it's Georgia's year, you have my respect, but you got to beat us first. I think Bryce Young at times has carried the offense because of his ability to create and make off-angle throws. Mentally, he's been overwhelmed. And I think that really always has to fall on the coaches. If you're playing guys that are mentally overwhelmed, that's a coaching failure. But there's no doubt in my mind, William Anderson has played far better than Bryce Young to this point. And Bryce Young is sort of carrying that offense, but teams are daring Bryce Young to carry the offense.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, another turnover. This game is just insane.
To me, it's MVP versus best player. If it's MVP, I'm okay with Bryce Young probably, because I do agree that without Bryce Young, they probably lose 3 games this year already. But best player, it's Will Anderson. I'd like to see Will Anderson and Hutchinson from Michigan in New York City this year. Like if I had my way, if I was filling out a Heisman ballot card, those two would be on it. And I'm not sure that I'm going MVP. I'm going best player.
Yeah. Well, I saw the statistics, and I don't want to steal them from somebody else, but they were talking like sats and tackles for loss. Will Anderson has more tackle. It's like double the tackles for loss than Ndamukong Suh has. And depending on how the Georgia game goes, he's going to meet or exceed his sack total. He's probably going to meet or exceed Chase Young's sack total. He's got more than double, I think, the tackles for loss than Young had. His numbers are insane. Everybody else that's ever been to the Heisman ceremony had very similar sack numbers to how Anderson's going to come out. But his tackle for loss, run defense numbers are 50% or more greater than any of them. And I mean, like Aaron Donald, Chase Young, and Ndamukong Suh, none of them were close. Will Anderson is the best player on that team, and it's not even close, man. It's not even close.
So we do need to give Georgia some love. We got a couple of super chats. Kirby Smart, the best defensive coach ever. Maybe. I think that there's a head coach at Baylor that's a pretty good defensive coach as well. Ever is a pretty big stretch because you got to contextualize it per year or per generation. But I think he's pretty good. Josh, you took a lot of heat, and maybe not deservedly so, because I think I defend you on this one. But Two-Face Tom is coming at you sarcastically about Brock Bowers, that people said he wasn't that special. Eric Gilbert was better. He wouldn't be putting up stats all year. I don't think you ever said he wouldn't be putting up stats all year. I think you contextualized that a lot with kind of what they had left, and they got to throw to somebody. But him having a good game today against a team that lost 55-0 to Notre Dame last week, I don't think is any kind of indictment on anything you've said so far.
Yeah, I made a very specific point with Bowers that had got taken way too far. And my point was, if you're Georgia and at one point in the year that your tight end is your best deep threat, that's not good. It wasn't like Bowers and Eric Gilbert. Now, one, I don't know that it's crazy to say that Eric Gilbert was better, but it's just because I think people have forgotten. Am I remembering this wrong, Daniel? Eric Gilbert was essentially a big receiver. I mean, his ceiling was Kyle Pitts. He was phenomenal.
And what you've said to that point, and just to flesh out a little more, is you said because Georgia fans are talking about how, on one hand, they tell us our offense is not nearly as good as it could be because we have all of these wide receivers out, which is an actual credible point. But then you said, okay, but if you have all these wide receivers out, an offense that tries to build their entire offense around a tight end, that's tough. And that generally doesn't work out, is what you said. And I think you're still proven right so far.
Yeah. The chat is kind of crazy, and right now I'm just ignoring it. I don't know if however we'll continue to do so. But the Eric Gilbert is a phenomenal downfield pass catching guy that can run routes like a receiver. Bowers is a really good tight end that makes phenomenal catches. He's great in clutch moments. That's what you want out of a tight end. But those guys, like Notre Dame in 2018, had phenomenal tight end play. NFL, they had NFL tight ends. They had 2 of them. And they looked lost when they played a high level offense because you cannot rely on tight ends to move the ball in chunks down the field. And Bowers, as good as he is, and you can run by Georgia Tech and you can run by UAB, when you play a playoff team, Bowers is not going to run by a playoff safety. He's just not at his size. In a red zone, he's a total weapon. He's a great player. He's a great asset to the offense. But you cannot run your explosiveness part of your offense through a tight end. And I don't think Georgia is trying to do that. And I don't think they want to. And now, I know people are going to mention Pickens when we do our video. And I don't know. I'm just like, fair warning. Pickens had 1 catch for 5 yards. He's not 100%. I could tell that in the game. Please stop. He might be a factor in the playoff, but he's not going to be a major factor in the SEC championship game. But yeah, we can move on to other super chats.
Somebody said mods asleep. It's party time. Mike Farino disagrees with our Bama take. He thinks Notre Dame would deserve to be in. And I'm okay with that if you are currently ranking Notre Dame ahead of Alabama. But you also, again, have to remember Notre Dame played 4 teams with a losing record in November. 3 of those, a minimum 8 loss. They look good because they are playing teams that are getting carpet bombed by mediocre teams. And that needs to be contextualized. Here's a good note, Josh, for you to touch on. Eric says Jimbo Fisher will not last 3 more years at Texas A&M. His old school, unimaginative, conservative offense, still in the 1980s. His play calling is abysmal. This is something that we've both criticized him for in the past. What do you think about that take?
It's the same conversation we just had about Bill O'Brien. Jimbo Fisher requires his quarterback to be, or tries to make his quarterback a high-level NFL quarterback. And here's the truth of it. Jimbo Fisher's not really bad at that. The problem is, in the current era, with all the advantages offenses have, I don't personally think you can make a guy be an NFL-style passer well enough to win a national title. What you can do is you can get a guy that is an NFL class passer like Mac Jones was last year for Alabama and let him run an RPO scheme and he can be insane. But I don't think you can pro style pass your way to success at any consistent level in college football anymore. I just don't think you can. A&M had a pretty good amount of points today against an LSU defense that is badly underrated. And I'm going to take something from Lamar. He said Lamar, who's always supporting our channel, and we really appreciate it, said, when you talk about LSU, I don't want to hear the word aberration. Texas A&M is a 4-loss team, and I hope they lose a 5th to Baylor or Oklahoma. That wasn't an aberration. LSU was a team that had a lot of guys opt out. They played really bad football, unmotivated football for a bit. The end of the year, they've played really well. And defensively, they played really, really well, and they've looked like the team with 5-star talent that they are. That is a top-tier talent team nationally. And they kind of had to readjust when they had a major roster turnover. But, A&M had a fair amount of points versus LSU for an old school football game. In this era, with the way teams play football now, playing an LSU team that isn't nearly as good, but actually played RPO style football and got the ball out and made shots, you're not going to win consistently like that. I just don't think you can. And I don't know. At this point, I doubt that Jimbo Fisher is ever going to make that adjustment. And in some ways, almost, if you're LSU, I don't know how much you even want Jimbo Fisher. I think he could make the program be stable like well administrated, which has been my complaint. But man, I mean, I don't know. He already recruits really well at A&M, and you're seeing the results. I don't know that you want that kind of a scheme and system at LSU, because I haven't seen much indication that it's going to be successful long term.
So I think this is as good a time as any to get into a top 10 if you have one, if you're thinking about having one. And it's going to be really, really challenging to do. I'm just going to go ahead and warn you because I've started to sneak ahead, and man, it's a bloodbath out there. But if you want to do that, we can do that.
Sure. I haven't been thinking on it, so let me look at my rankings. Can we give me just? You don't have to do your top 10, but give me some stall time. Maybe you'll do.
No,
a
I'll
super
take
chat
it. I'll
so I can
take a
think about
super
it.
chat. Yeah, that's fine. Gage Lee says, thankful for Turkey Day and the great content y'all put out each week. We appreciate y'all showing up. It's huge for us. Like this is something that we were going to kind of maybe do a couple of times this year, and it's turned out to be it's so much fun, and more people are showing up every week, and we really, really do appreciate it. Indefinite said a long time ago, but we are getting to it. Bama plays like they have the last few weeks. Georgia will smoke them, especially with a 42 points per game offense getting healthy. I agree. If Alabama plays offensively this week or defensively like they did last week against Georgia next week, they'll get killed. The question is, what if Alabama puts both sides of the ball together because they're playing with house money? Hobson says Notre Dame beats Alabama today. Auburn is terrible. I don't think you can really play it that way. Again, maybe Notre Dame would beat Alabama today, but I also think that we're talking about a Notre Dame team that really struggled offensively early in the year, middle of the year, and has played a bunch of really, really bad teams down the stretch. Nothing like Auburn would smoke probably anybody that Notre Dame played this year except for Cincinnati, not Auburn, Arkansas. LW said, roll tide. I'll take an Iron Bowl win in that Voodoo Stadium. Alabama fans really do have a bit of feel for Voodoo in that stadium, so I'm sure that they're loving that. Killtack9 says, is there something in the fact that Alabama did thoroughly shut down Auburn run game and that might fare good or speak to something they could do against Georgia? And I will say that we're going to touch on this in our preview a lot, but I will say Alabama held a good running offense to 0.6 yards per carry today. The question is, will they cross the 50 against Alabama? Disrespectfully says Coach O is better than Dan Mullen. I don't know about that.
No.
Maybe. I don't.
No.
I think Coach O
No.
caught lightning in a bottle last year or 2019, but no, I don't think he's better than Dan Mullen.
Here's the point I would make. You can talk about Coach O being better because of his ability to recruit, though a lot of that is ingrained in what LSU is. This LSU team, if they had actually played like this with half their defensive starters and Butte on the field, this would not be a team ending 6-6. This team had no business being 6-6. Florida was a monster of Mullen's own making, but that wasn't a great roster.
And Josh, do we want to just compare their tenures at Mississippi schools and look at receipts? Because if we're talking about where you can't just recruit like crazy, one of them got fired and was a massive failure, and the other
you can be massively successful at Florida because of all the talent that exists in Florida that can be gotten. You will be successful at LSU because there's a lot of talent that will always go to LSU, and that is not the case at Florida. So there's sort of a floor at LSU that doesn't exist at Florida, and we can debate whether the ceilings are higher one or the other, but the floor is different. All right, I got my my.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and do yours because I've still got a couple to fill out.
All right. So everybody's going to be upset with this top 10. I'm going to start it right there and listen to me carefully. There is no easy way for us to be able to rank a top 10 right now with everything that exists in college football. And nobody really deserves to be top 10 outside of Georgia. So just keep that in mind. Number 1 is Georgia. It's obvious. They thumped Georgia Tech. They look dominant in doing so. It is a team that lost 55-0 to Notre Dame last week, but Georgia has been dominant on both sides of the ball all year. They're a top 3 offense in terms of points per drive. They play slower, so people look at the scores and they don't realize what it means, but they're just burning clock and scoring and burning clock and scoring, and it is a slow march to death for everyone that plays them. We probably should have talked about them more than we have, but it's just hard to. My number 2, people are already going to be mad, is Alabama. Hear me out. My number 2 is Alabama. My number 3 is Michigan. My number 4 is Ohio State. I'll just tell you 2, 3, and 4 because I want to talk about them together. Michigan this year and Alabama have the same record. Michigan's loss was to Michigan State team that I don't know if they are or not really better than Texas A&M. And you can talk about records all you want. Michigan State had a very weak schedule. But Michigan has been up and down, and like 20-13 against Rutgers is really, really bad. You can talk about nearly losing to Auburn all you want. Auburn is on a different planet than Rutgers. Michigan has played well throughout the stretch, but like 21-17 Penn State, I think that's about the same team as Auburn based off an on the field result. I think Alabama's potential is a lot higher than Michigan. Michigan maybe is a little bit more consistent, especially on the defensive side of the ball. But Alabama's ceiling is definitely a lot higher. Their ability to score on a high-level defense, I think, is a lot higher because they have a more vertical attack, especially since Bell went out for Michigan. That's why I have Alabama above Michigan. And then Ohio State, I got a 2-loss team at number 4 ahead of Cincinnati at number 5, and that's going to make people hella mad. But I always say if you lose, especially if you lose close to a team that I have like in the top 3, I'm going to be really hesitant to drop you very far because, look, I don't think Cincinnati is going to beat a top team right now either. Just being blunt, I don't. And when you look at Cincinnati and their schedule, and they blew up Eastern Carolina, who's a bad team. They blew up SMU that was a little bit overranked. And then before then, struggle win against Tulsa, struggle win against Tulane, struggle win against Navy. There have been a lot of rough patches for Cincinnati. It's tough. I could put them above Ohio State if you want to make that argument. I'm not going to complain. I think it's hard for me to put them ahead of Michigan, given who Michigan's played and how Michigan's done and who Michigan's beaten. Maybe I should put Cincinnati ahead of Ohio State, but resume, record versus quality, it's a very, very tough decision. And the strength of schedule is just way, way, way different between those two schools. My number, again, 5 was Cincinnati, 6 is Notre Dame. Notre Dame, we're getting to the point where I don't think these teams could ever have any hope of passing the ones in front of them. Cincinnati's head-to-head over Notre Dame is real. I don't care what people say about whatever they think the spread would be for Notre Dame with Cincinnati. I don't think Notre Dame would be favored over Cincinnati right now. I think Notre Dame should be lucky to be number 6 based off the quality level that they're at. I kind of have Notre Dame here, frankly, because who else are you going to put? Notre Dame has been good down the stretch. I mean, some of those wins, like 44-34 over North Carolina, haven't held up to be much of a win. 32-29 over Virginia Tech does not look good in retrospect. Close win over Florida State in the opener. I think Notre Dame has played a much weaker schedule than we want to give credit for. They get a lot of traction over their blowout win over Wisconsin, which is really the one good win on that whole resume. And Wisconsin is clearly a team that can go into total implosion mode. And I remind people, Wisconsin game was 10-10 at the start of the fourth quarter. Wisconsin got down, had to go into catch-up mode, and that caused the game to run away really, really late when Wisconsin was throwing the ball every play and throwing interceptions. Next for me, number 7 is Ole Miss. We've been on the Ole Miss bandwagon, week 2 of the season. It's probably the most underrated team in the country. They're going to finish 10-2. They're going to finish 10-2 with a very difficult schedule. Their only losses were to Auburn in a game where they were out 5 offensive starters, and to Alabama in a blowout, which there's no real shame in that early. They beat Arkansas. They beat LSU by multiple touchdowns. They beat Tennessee. They blew out Liberty. They beat Texas A&M by multiple scores. They beat Mississippi State by multiple scores. They have absolutely, in my mind, earned the right to be number 7. Number 8 for me is going to be the winner of the Oklahoma State-Oklahoma game. It's currently 33-37 while I'm recording this, so I don't know who's going to win. But I feel like the story's a little bit similar on both sides. I am not super high on the Big 12. It's hard for me to overlook the fact that you've got a one-loss team, but I can't put them any higher than this. Even I'm going to have them behind a 2-loss Ole Miss because I just think the Big 12 is very weak this year. And again, not scheduling any P5s out of conference is a real negative for me for Oklahoma State. And then Oklahoma does, but they look very unimpressive in a lot of games. Number 9 for me is Michigan State. Frankly, they're just kind of there by default. I think they're a solid team with a good defense. I think they're horribly flawed in the back end. I think if they played in a more pass happy league, like even in the Big 12, even if they're a better team than Big 12 teams, they'd have a kind of a crummy record because they're so flawed. And then number 10 for me is Baylor. So you end up, whoever loses Oklahoma State, Oklahoma is going to be out of the top 10 in my mind. Baylor sits there at 10 based off past record and performance, but with their backup quarterback in, they are not really a top 10 team. I just don't like to drop you out of the top 10 when you first lose your quarterback. And I'm not actually 100% sure. It's partly my own fault for how long he's going to be out. But that's my top 10. People are going to say some of these teams don't belong, but man, try to tell me who I left out that's an obvious pick, because I don't think there really is any. And you got a whole bunch of 2 and 3 loss teams after this, all of which have warts. People want chaos, and chaos means warts, and that's what you got in 2021.
Yeah, and the big the big difference for me and you, I think, are where Michigan is and where Ohio State is. Georgia number 1 doesn't require a lot of discussion. I've got Michigan at number 2, and I think that there are legitimate complaints about a couple of things about Michigan. Like, one, the Rutgers game is a real concern for me. They beat Penn State on basically a kind of a like lucky, I want to say lucky deep play to the tight end, I think it was, but they still won that game. And Penn State, as we've said this whole show, is better than their record. But to me, winning the game they won today in the manner that they won it, maybe if they squeak by, it's a little different. But I think Ohio State is a legitimately good team. I don't even think they're as good as you think they are. And yet you've got Alabama ahead of them. And I think you're giving Alabama fairly, I think, in your mind, in more of a power ranking style. Alabama does have a higher ceiling than Michigan. They do. If Alabama puts offense and defense together on the same day, they're beating Georgia. The problem is, until they do that, I'm not going to give them credit for it. And they haven't done it since Mississippi State in like week 4 or 5 or something like that. Since then, and since there's been some book out on how to attack Bryce Young, they haven't put both together. So I can't give them credit for doing something I think they can do without having seen them do it at least once. And they didn't even do it against Arkansas. I got Cincinnati at number 3. And I hate to do this because I like the EC, I think it was ECU, like not even a great win. Like South Florida, not a great win. They need to be beating these teams by 40 points because they have that luxury. But I also think Cincinnati is a solid team. And I think that if you put them in that game against Auburn today, I can't honestly say that they're down 10-3 with 1:20 left on the clock. I don't think they would be. So after Cincinnati, I have Alabama. This is academic. If they beat Georgia, they're in. If they don't, they're not. For all of our discussion of whether or not Alabama should be punished for that last game, I think it will be sort of like we did with Oklahoma in that, or the AP did. Like we were pushing Oklahoma down in our rankings for barely beating bad teams, right? The floodgates of dropping Alabama will open if they lose to Georgia, and it will be kind of a payback for them barely beating mediocre teams the prior weeks before. And maybe that's not fair, but that's what's going to happen. It's like that loss, even though it's an excusable loss, opens the window for people to have an excuse to punish them for those close wins that happened earlier. After Alabama, I have Ole Miss. People might scoff at that. Ole Miss is 10-2. They're actually playing decent defense. And do you really think in a bowl game or a one-off game scenario with Lane Kiffin having a month to prepare for you that he couldn't beat almost any other team in the top 10, including Alabama, who killed them? I think he could. After that, I got the OU OK State winner. The problem with this for me a little bit is that same thing with Baylor is the thing that you're always talking about in terms of looking at 2 mountain peaks. We don't know that maybe these 2 mountain peaks are just really low peaks, but because we have no context of larger mountain peaks, we don't know that they're not very good because the Big 12 has played nobody out of conference. After that, I have Ohio State. Um, I would have Ohio State higher if they didn't get murdered today. That defense was never forced Michigan to be uncomfortable. And that's what concerns me a little bit with Ohio State right now and the scoring inefficiencies. Ohio State could go out tomorrow and beat Alabama by 20 points or lose to Alabama by 20 points. I don't know who I'm going to get with them, but I still have them in my top 10 ahead of Michigan State, who they absolutely dragged last week. Michigan State feels a little bit like my number 10 in Baylor in that they're kind of a paper tiger and they shouldn't be in the top 10. But if I'm going to say that for other teams, I got to say it for these two. Like, okay, who else are we going to put in there? BYU? I don't know. Like Iowa, maybe they're 9-2 or 10-2, whatever. That's respectable. But right now, until somebody else does something, I got to give credit for the schedule in the season so far. And Michigan State's, 10-2. So credit to them. So, Josh, thoughts in general about how much we can expect shakeup in the top 10 come championship week, or is it almost kind of settled?
I think there has to be some amount of shakeup, right? Like one of Michigan or Iowa is going to lose. One of Alabama or Georgia is going to lose. Cincinnati could easily lose to Houston. A lot of people think they will. Um, and the Pac-12 is a little bit out of it, but you're going to end up with, looking at it right now, Oklahoma State's up 37-33 trying to push it away. If Oklahoma State loses to Baylor, then that adds a whole other wrinkle. There's more opportunities for chaos than we've seen in years. But the truth is the chaos. Georgia's in, right? I think we all know this and agree with this. Georgia's in. If there's any chaos, Alabama's going to be in after losing to Georgia because you're running out of one-loss teams of any quality. Cincinnati may or may not be in, but I mean, like if Georgia's a lock, and let's say Cincinnati loses, right? Maybe that opens the door for Notre Dame, but I think Notre Dame's still behind Alabama. So if anybody loses, Alabama is still in that door. And so then you're just kind of looking at Michigan, Cincinnati, Notre Dame. It's kind of the same group of teams that are just going to shuffle in. The teams at the bottom are not going to really be able to jump that far up. It's just more who's going to fall in those 3 and 4 slots. And it's more just shuffling within each other depending on who wins or loses. The one thing I'll say, you mentioned BYU. There's a lot of rankings nationally that I don't like. BYU is an example of it. They're 13th in the country. They have 2 losses. But again, if you look at their schedule, man, like lost to Boise State hasn't held up great. They got lost by 2 touchdowns to Baylor, which is Baylor's big win. People point to as a big out of conference win. But BYU is really living on 10-point wins over Utah and Arizona State. Arizona State didn't end up being great. Utah is barely hanging in at the bottom of the rankings and is not great. BYU a lot of times sort of lives off their tangential association with the Pac-12, and I think them at 13 is probably a pretty serious mistake. So when you talk about the rankings in general, people can criticize it all they want, but I think more than anything, to maybe answer your question and round out this discussion, I think there are a lot of teams in the 10 to 20 range that we aren't discussing right now with better-ish records. BYU is an example. Wake Forest is a really good example that I think are probably worse, maybe even a good bit worse than 3, 4, even 5-loss teams in the SEC and Big Ten that just got to that point because they played much harder schedules. I think schedules are really, really disparate this year. I think schedule quality is a huge deal and is being underplayed. And I think bowls aren't going to shake, or I think the conference championship games aren't going to shake stuff up. But I think we're going to have for a wild bowl season where teams are just not going to pan out the way we think they will. You're muted, Daniel.
I didn't want to hear didn't want y'all to hear all my ice rattling and background noises. I said Russell's Reserve from the same people that do Wild Turkey. It's actually really good. Yeah, what's interesting to me, you say bowls. It'll be interesting to see where things get slotted. So if let's say Michigan loses next week, then and the Big Ten doesn't get a team in the playoffs, then the Big Ten's going to be slotted really well. What if that means Alabama gets in with Georgia? Then the SEC is going to be slotted really poorly. The interesting thing to me in terms of judging whether or not, holy cow, Caleb Williams just had a monster run for Oklahoma State. The interesting thing to me will be how many teams have guys sit out, which will be really, it's hard to judge at that point relative quality. And this is where I get really frustrated about teams like the Big 12 not playing Power 5 teams out of conference. We'll never know. Like, we're going to end this season and never know. And that's what's really frustrating to me. But that maybe is a different topic for a different day. Somebody asked, based on our top 25, and people are always, because they know we're friends with RJ Young, they're always wanting our takes on his takes. And RJ Young is on one extreme, and our rankings are kind of on the other extreme, in that RJ has a formula that he sticks to, and until you lose, he's going to move you up. And whether you agree with that or not, he at least sticks to it. I don't necessarily agree with it, because I think that we got to look beyond win and loss records, but he is consistent in how he ranks, and he's trying to remove subjectivity because that's tough. On the flip side, you and I rank more on a power ranking basis because we are more focused on the elite teams at the top and what it's going to take to get into a national championship game, what it's going to take to win in the playoffs. And I think that's where we kind of differ. Josh, I'll let you take this one. On Tap Sports, quoting you, saying Alabama's ceiling is a lot higher than Michigan's. That's what Ohio State fans told me about their team. Go Blue. Love the show, fellas. I'll let you take that one.
I missed that. Can you repeat the question for me?
On Tap Sports is quoting you when you said Alabama's ceiling is a lot higher than Michigan's, saying, that's what Ohio State fans told me about their team all week. Did give us a shout out as well, but at the end of it, but did,
okay. Yeah, sorry,
poke you a little bit on that.
Yeah, I missed that a little bit. I was looking for the shot to the end zone. For me, Oklahoma State is 4th and 10 now. I mean, Ohio State does have a higher ceiling than Michigan, and they still lost.
Right.
And that's, I mean, the end of the day, that's what matters, right? Oh, and there, Oklahoma goes down. Take another. Caleb Williams takes a lot of sacks in this situation where he's just got to put the ball up. Rough way to go down after making a hero play, and I think should have been two pass interferences in a row. They had one like the Georgia Alabama championship game where they threw and a guy was out of bounds in the back of the end zone, but there was actually a takedown of the guy in front of him. It didn't get called.
That always really ignorance, Josh, but like, okay, it's 33-37. I thought it was 34-37. I'm like, why are they not kicking here? But that's why.
It's a 4-point game. 4 points. But the point with Michigan, I really try to rank on the entire schedule, and I always say, if you traded schedules, how would you have done with their schedule? How would they have done with yours? It's not just like a power ranking thing. If you're losing games, I assume you're losing games for a reason, and you'll continue to lose games. Michigan beating Ohio State is a really, really big deal. And that's something that Alabama hasn't matched. But Alabama's close game with Auburn is, in my mind, not all that different than some of the close games that Michigan has had through the year. And so it's just hard for me to rank the two.
Is it some of it recency bias as well? Like, the game against Rutgers is long forgotten. The game against Oklahoma State opening with 3
and Nebraska.
Yeah, I mean, Oklahoma State opened with 3 FCS or G5 teams, beat all 3 by 1 score, but we forget about it, and we just got a comment saying if a 1-loss Oklahoma State should be in. We don't punish that, but we are killing Alabama for week 3 against Florida, and we're killing them now. And some of it to me is sequencing. But I also think that, like, I think that had Michigan beaten the crap out of Ohio State in week 3, we would have been unfairly diminishing that win. Like we were with, frankly, we collectively, everybody was with Oregon until they lost, last week.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. And I circle back to the fact, and I don't know if you want to record it separately or what. We never did end up talking about Ohio State, Michigan in depth.
Yeah, we can do a little cut up. And guys, this might be the end for us. I'm sick. I'm losing my voice. And Josh is going to turn into a pumpkin on camera. So this one might be a little shorter than normal. But yeah, let's get into clap for the cut up. Josh, let's get into kind of a review of Michigan, Ohio State. You picked this game, Ohio State winning closer. I picked Ohio State win by about 14. Other than the scoring efficiency issues that I've pointed out and been dragged by Ohio State fans, were you more surprised really with the defense from Ohio State this year or in this game based on what you've seen this year?
I was. Defensively, look, we flagged in our model. I'm going to pull it up here on the fly, but we flagged in our model that there was reasons to be concerned about Ohio State's defensive numbers and defensive efficiency and how much it was sort of a product of the teams they played. 80% of opponent rushing averages is a good, really good number. Not necessarily elite, but a really good number. 91% of opponent passing averages is really average. And my concern, and the reason that I said this would potentially be a close game, is Michigan was right at the threshold of being competent run, competent pass. They were expected to be balanced. I didn't expect them to run as well as they did. And I think it's really interesting, odd. I mean, rivalry games, people always say that they're really unpredictable. The truth is, college football is really unpredictable. Rivalry games are actually a little less unpredictable, but they feel that way because they matter more. And I think people forget how many, like Ohio State nearly losing to Maryland a couple years ago, right? Like how often that actually happens in college football. But when it happens in a rivalry game, we feel like that matters. That was a real game. But here's my thing with Michigan's performance against Ohio State. Last several games, 4.3 yards per carry against Maryland, 3.5 against Penn State, went kind of off for 4.9 against Indiana, but 4.3 against Michigan State, 4.8 against Nebraska. They were under 3 yards per carry against Rutgers and Wisconsin. They've been very up and down all year. And it's interesting to me that they could go in this game and Haskins could average 6 yards a carry. And as a team, they averaged 7.2 yards per carry. It's 2.5 yards over their average, right?
That's wild.
And we talk about this a lot. When you are over your average against a team like Ohio State, which, again, Ohio State's numbers, our model, we're flagging were not elite, but they are really good. That does say a little bit that they maybe found something Ohio State couldn't defend, and I can't really point to anything in particular in this game. But it also could just be being better prepared, somebody having a bad game. Look, if Ohio State plays their B-plus game and Michigan plays their B-plus game, they are not averaging 7.2 yards per carry. That is a very, very high number. One of the best rushing games Michigan's put up. Not only is it the third best run game that Michigan's put up this year, but it's one of the best run games they put up in years. I'm looking they had one game better in 2020. This would have been better than any run game in 2019. They had one game better in 2018. This was an elite top end production game for Michigan. And I'm not taking it away from Michigan to say that some of this is maybe preparation for Ohio State, a particular matchup problem, or maybe it's just a bad game for Ohio State, but it definitely got away from them in a manner that I don't think was predictable, or, honestly, I'm not even sure it was really repeatable.
I think the thing that kind of took Ohio State by surprise and was tough to adjust in game was how good McNamara was doing. The run game really came on for them, but early on he was consistent and he was keeping the chains moving. And I think they really hit their stride scoring late in the second quarter into the third quarter. So it wasn't boatloads of points early on, although the interception in the goal line, on the goal line, they could have had even more points. But I think he was the difference maker in that they probably prepped all week a lot for that run game. They did not necessarily expect to have to also defend the pass. And then Ohio State went into and had to go into a too high safety look that they've been doing a lot more since Kerry Coombs is gone, or not calling the plays anymore. But they're more comfortable, I think, in that single high safety look to really affect the run game, and they weren't able to do that because there was enough production from the quarterback to keep them on their heels and keep them having to game plan for that. So I think that was a big deal. On the flip side, Ohio State did the thing that they've been doing all year, where look, I feel like Ohio State, and I said earlier in the show, they can put up 50 points on a good defense, or they can really struggle, but put up the same amount of yards. And that's what they did tonight or today is they put up a whole bunch of yards. But at some point in, I think, the fourth quarter, they had like 13 points. And that's the big problem with Ohio State this year is, and we saw it Minnesota, we saw it Oregon, and we're seeing it now, is that those efficiency, bugaboos are still showing up. And Josh, this kind of, I want you to touch on this too. Isn't this why you preach we need to look at the whole schedule, and we don't need to be affected by recency bias, and we don't need to be affected by a 4-game stretch where we don't play anybody and things look better? Week 1 to week 12, yes, you can improve or get bad over that course of time, get worse, but it's still within the same season. So there is something to those data points.
Yeah, when you look at Ohio State's season this year, right, in rush defense, they've been under 5 yards a carry from opponents all year. The one exception was Purdue, and they didn't run it very much. They were about 4.8. But other than that game, they had been holding teams under 3.6 yards per carry since Oregon. And what did they do against Oregon? They gave up 7.1 yards per carry. And we feel like, well, that Oregon game is week 2. There were other problems. We changed defensive coordinator, yada, yada. Something I kept flagging, Coombs' scheme to me was flawed in large part because that single high safety made things really tough on their corners. I didn't have a problem with a single high safety look versus the run. That's the one thing it should be good at. So there were issues with them maintaining the edge in Oregon and some other things, but getting run over was not a good look by Ohio State against Oregon. And I think a lot of those same things came out, especially in terms of that defensive line. Just to be blunt, it's just not as good as people wanted to make them out to be preseason. I think that just has to be accepted at this point. And the other thing that we talked about all year, and you talk about recency bias, Ohio State with their receiving core was really, really boom or bust. If they can get the ball to the receivers, I tweeted this during the game, they could put up a number, right? But if teams could get pressure and they could get Stroud off his mark, and especially if they could affect the run game, Ohio State started getting really sputtery. They started getting really herky-jerky, and teams could play bend but don't break, let them get to the red zone, or let them start getting midfield and then stop them once they got out of RPO kill zone range. And I think that all repeated itself. I think Stroud has played much, much better at the end of the year, but there were still several throws throughout that game that he plain missed, because if he starts getting pressure, he doesn't set his feet properly. He's a first-time starter. A lot of guys, Bryce Young, who was the same Heisman conversation, had the same problem. Stroud looked better today than Young did. Let me be clear. But you still have that problem. And those are the things that I had seen from Ohio State all season. And I always said these are the nits that I pick if you want to win a championship, if you want to win the playoff, because those nits show up in a game like number 5 Michigan. And, you throw for 394 yards, 2 touchdowns, 34-49 passing, and you lose at 8 yards per attempt. I think it's interesting as an aside. I made the Bryce Young comparison. I'm just going to make this in passing. Alabama had 388 yards of offense and only 24 points. Ohio State had 458 yards of offense and only 27 points. As little as Alabama produced at times, Ohio State scored 3 more points. And I know there's OT, but they didn't really get a lot of points in OT because it was a new format, right? And I know they only scored, 10 in regulation. But the point being, Ohio State all year long has struggled to convert yards to points. Early in the year, they showed that the defensive line had some deficiencies. And so if you look at the entire season, I think all those things really came home to roost.
Yeah. I also just want to give credit to Michigan. I mean,
yeah, and I'm about to say, I want to turn this conversation to be positive on Michigan because I don't want to leave that out.
Well, and this is not like, we're not saying this retroactively. Like we've been saying all year, starting about the middle of the year, and now it's confirmed, but we said going into this game, even though we picked Ohio State, that this is Jim Harbaugh's best coaching job that we can remember in a really long time. And probably ever at Michigan. And I say this, I opened the show crediting McNamara, but he's still not an elite quarterback. He's not a top 5, maybe top 10, but I don't think so. Quarterback, he's good, not great. And knowing that, and knowing the turnover he's had at defensive coordinator and with Gaddis at offensive coordinator, it's a credit to him and what he's done. And I know you say that he's kind of caught a little bit of luck in how the old school model is working a little more this year than it has in the past. But either way, he's earned a chance to have a very winnable game and be in the playoffs. And that deserves unbelievable credit after coming off, a not great year last year and maybe a disappointing year the year before. He got the Ohio State monkey off his back. And they're probably ready to offer him a lifetime contract at this point. But talk a little bit about the job he's done this year.
Yeah, I think it's hard for people to take the positivity stuff away that they should. I just made up a word for Michigan because of the way the schedule went, right? Like Western Michigan, Washington wasn't nearly as good as they were expected to be this year. Northern Illinois, they had what should have been a marquee team to begin the year. Didn't end up being that way. And then you have Rutgers. And even though they're winning a lot of those games big, nobody really took major positive away from it. And then you have like the struggle against Rutgers, and you have a good win against a Wisconsin team that wasn't ranked at the time, close win against Nebraska. And people were, I think, sort of skittish. And I think maybe somewhat rightly so that Rutgers close game doesn't look great in retrospect. Rutgers was playing good football at the time, but Nebraska, whatever. And then that Michigan State loss just felt like validation. But you look at it afterwards, and you blow out Indiana, you beat Penn State, you destroy Maryland, you blow out Ohio State. We talk about the totality of the season. Look, it's not just recency bias. There are a lot of signs that Michigan is a good football team. I think they had struggles when Bell went out. It took them a while to sort of get resettled. They lost a game to Michigan State that they were kind of almost in control of at one point. And that we all kind of wrote them off. But in my view with Michigan, they managed a not great quarterback situation. They managed an injury to by far their best wide receiver in Bell, which would have been devastating to a lot of teams. I mean, if Ohio State lost, I mean, they've got 3 great receivers, I know, but if they lost Olave, they would not have been the same team even. And then they paired it by having a great run game with, Corum, who got hurt a bunch, and then Haskins, who was dominant. And then the defense this year was so much better than it had been from a consistency basis versus when it was in Don Brown. Clearly scaled a lot better, was always our complaint, lack of scaling. Across the board, I think Michigan was really an underrated team. I think Michigan still has their limitations. I think they're going to struggle in a game where if Ohio State had put up, like a lot of points early, if they've been struggling, Michigan probably would have been maybe out of their game plan a little bit. And I'm not sure how patient you can be. But the brand of football they're playing this year, which a lot of it runs through like a Jabo and Hutchinson is an absolute dude. It's just good winning football. And in a year where, and let me make this point before I turn it back to you. I've said to you, I know on and off air a number of times, this season was a little bit of a throwback. And I don't know if it's a 1-year thing or if it's a change in the way defenses are able to play offenses. But I think it benefited Michigan to a large extent because the things that Michigan does and wants to do and the style of football Harbaugh wants to play, which is efficiency-based, consistency offense, I think worked in a year where there weren't teams that could regularly put up over 40 points a game. And you combine that with an offense that has modernized some under Gaddis, and you ended up with a really, really good team that was well built for what you needed to be in 2021 to win and has absolutely in front of them a shot to play in the playoff.
Yeah, and our resident Bama knucklehead is in the chat causing a stir, dragging Hutchinson. And I'm gonna say right now, like that tells me that Horatio hasn't watched the tape, and because Will Anderson, I think, is the best player in the country. I'm on record as saying it. I think that if I were filling out a Heisman ballot, Will Anderson would have my number one vote. I think he is the best player for Alabama, the best player in the country, and if he were draft eligible, would be number one overall. If you watch that game today, Hutchinson jumped off the tape. Like, and not just in see quarterback, get quarterback. Like he almost got his hand on that final score screenplay, bailing in coverage after he recognized it. Like, he's a great elite football player. He's a top 5 draft pick quality football player. And I think that he hasn't gotten his due this year, even though people love him. And people down here in SEC country don't give him enough credit. I think if I were writing a ballot, he would be my number 2 on the list. Like, I would have him in New York City as well. And I wish people would give him his due.
Agreed. I think one of the things that happens, and you see it on our chat a lot, you see it in our comment section, frankly, people don't have time to watch football of every game around the country. Like, for me to be able to do this and sit and talk to you guys right now, I'm watching 5 games at a time all day today. It's kind of exhausting. I mean, you can tell we're tired, but I think people just don't recognize how good Hutchinson is. I think a lot of people in Big Ten country don't realize how good Anderson is. And when you start making those comparisons, and they're like, well, he's clearly better because he has this number. No, he's clearly better, and this guy sucks, blah, blah, blah. They're both phenomenal football players. Phenomenal football players. Anderson would be the best defensive player in a lot of years. That's the thing I think people miss. Hutchinson might be the best football player in years where you don't have someone quite like Anderson. Anderson's like on a Chase Young, statistically, absolutely on a Chase Young level. Statistically, actually a little better than Young's best year right now. But Hutchinson absolutely is a dude. That Michigan defense is absolutely legitimately great. And they're a very physical team on offense. And I think Ohio State ran into that with a team that is very modern, but Young had a lot of turnover at key positions, and the defensive side of the ball that for whatever reason just didn't gel this year. And when you put all together, the consistent, steady hand at Michigan finally was able to break the curse and break the streak.
All right, so as we wind this down, and Stephen Light is still in the house. I see him still chatting, so hello to him. Just in terms of Michigan's season forward, like, have they accomplished enough this year that even if they lost their next 2 games, it really doesn't matter because they've had a great year to this point? Or have they gotten a little taste, Josh? And now if they don't make some noise in the playoffs, they're going to be really disappointed.
I think it's an interesting question. I don't really know, okay, and there's always a delay, but you Michigan fans, as we wrap up here, put in the comments, really, not your hype version where you're trying to speak things into existence, but what is your real take on where Michigan is at? And if you're watching this later, tell us in the comment section, do you think, or do you have an expectation for Michigan to play in the playoffs? And let's assume you don't play Georgia in week 1. Do you expect to win your first playoff game if it's against Cincinnati or Oklahoma State or Alabama? Like, what is your reasonable expectation? I don't know where it's at for Michigan because I think they were much more focused on beating Ohio State, and I think they're just now turning their attention to the idea of the playoff. But right now, man, you still got to beat Iowa, and I don't think that's a given. So let's put one foot in front of the other, and I think that's where, if I were a Michigan fan, I think that's where my mind would be right now.
Yeah, I mean, it is when you play a team with an elite something on one side of the ball or the other, which I think Iowa's defense is borderline elite, there is a chance you could lose. So I think that's the thing that they got to fight now, because they're on this super high and they're playing a team that has some losses. And there is this pull to not be super focused and prepared because you're already thinking playoffs and you're already thinking matchups and that sort of thing. But 2 things. I think, one, they're this close to a conference title, which I think there would probably be a tinge of disappointment if they don't win their conference this year, given that they crested the Ohio State mountain. But I guarantee you that this offseason, after the momentary sting of that loss went away, if they got blown out in the first round of the playoffs, and I'm not saying they will, we're talking hypotheticals because that's what we do. I think they could still walk away extremely satisfied, deservingly so, they should, with what they did this season. And maybe that's me speaking as someone who's not a Michigan fan, but I think that would be the case. Josh, anything else as we wind this up? You said 90 minutes. We've gone a little more than that. As we wind this up, maybe a parting shot for what you saw and what we learned today.
Well, here's my parting shot is UTSA lost 45-23 to North Texas, who's a 6-6 team in the G5. And I just want to rub my temples when we talk about teams that have schedules where you can have closest wins to like Southern. We talked about 2 weeks ago, right? 27-17 to Southern Miss was a really bad sign. And 31-28 Memphis. They had a lot of close games. One score win over UNLV. This is a year where you've got to put behind you your thought process that wins and losses are the be all end all. And if you want to talk about a team or why they're good or bad, you need to actually pull up that team schedule, look for every win and loss on that team schedule, and then do the research to find out how good those teams are before you crack on them. Because there's a lot of parity. A lot of teams have had stupid or weird losses, but the parity that exists within the Big Ten and within the SEC is totally different than the parity that exists within Conference USA or within the Big 12. It's just not the same, I think, this year. And with a lot of conferences, and we've been dinging the Big 12 all night on this, not playing out of conference games against P5 teams and choosing to be isolated, I think people have a little bit of blinders to that. And I think that, to me, is really the story of 2021, coming out of 2020 where we didn't have out of conference games. And I thought 2021 would be better. And I think we're still in the same boat. And I think, assuming we actually have more bowls, I really feel like we're sort of in for a lot of shocking results.
Yeah, and the UTSA note is funny because they needed a miracle last week to beat UAB. And it just shows you the disparity between the kind of world that the G5 operates in, the average G5. I'm not talking about Cincinnati. The average G5 operates in, and they get infinite credit for wins that Power 5 teams get actually punished for if they don't blow them out. And I think that we're pretending, the emperor has no clothes. We're pretending that that dichotomy doesn't exist. And that for one group of people, a win is a win is a win. And for the other group of people, when they play the team you beat that you got credit for, but they don't blow them out, we're going to drop them in the polls. And I just don't think that's right. And we're being asked to participate in a rain dance, and I hate it. All right, y'all, let us know anything you want in the comments. If you've hung on this long after live show and you're watching this in the replay, podcasters, we're thankful so much for you for listening as well. We got a ton of content coming out this week. Previews, obviously it's championship week. We're going to be talking a lot of football, so keep an eye out for that. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great weekend, and God bless.